Hey, welcome back to my channel. My name is Casey. I'm so excited to have you here with me today. Today I'm going to be talking about eyeshadow palettes that to me, in my opinion, were a major letdown. The inspiration for this video actually came from my very last video where I talked about the idea of fantasy palettes. Those palettes very often are a love at first sight type of thing. They put this glimmering image in your mind of how it will make you feel, how it will make you look.
I am beautiful. We're young.
Ultimately, you end up purchasing it based on this fantasy you've created. And unfortunately, sometimes when you get this fantasy palette and you open it and you swatch it and you play with it, you adorn your eyes with it, then your fantasy sort of blows to smithereens. It's very heartbreaking. It's not funny. It's very serious. Being the eyeshadow palette lover that I am, I have experienced it a couple of times, and I'm here to share those experiences with you here today. Before we get into the video, I want to make some necessary disclaimers. Of course, everything that I say today is based on my own opinion, based on my own preferences. There are a couple palettes I'm going to be mentioning that I'm fully prepared for there to be some disagreements. That's wonderful. In fact, if you do disagree with me, I would love to hear from you. I'd love if you left a comment. Give us your review on the palette. Let us know why you love it, because maybe your preferences align with another viewer's preferences. And what you have to say about the palette is exactly what they're looking for. So I welcome all the feedback. That I think our differing opinions is what makes the beauty community so fun and so helpful. That's why we're all here. So if you do disagree with me, please don't be mad at me. Don't be mad at me, please. Instead, please do give your feedback. We're all just here to have a good time. Second, I don't think any of the palettes I'm talking about today are inherently bad palettes. Well, with the exception of one, maybe two. When I get a palette and I use it a couple of times, if I don't reach for it ever again because I'm choosing various other palettes over it every single time, I deem that as sort of a letdown because it doesn't stand out. It's not unique amongst everything else I have to choose from. So in my mind, my money is better spent on something else. If I had the opportunity to give the palette back in exchange for what I spent on it, I would gladly take my money back because it's just sitting and going to waste in my collection. Lastly, I just want to apologize for the lighting in this video. I have been planning to film this video every single day this week, and it has been cloudy every single day. When I woke up today, there was snow on the ground. It's October 14th, and there's snow on the ground. Here in Minnesota, we've officially entered the gray seasons. The darkness is settling. Winter is coming. I'm not happy about it either. I'll try my best to fix the lighting when I do my editing, but I apologize. It is not the best quality. Bear with me. All right, let's get to talking about eyeshadow palettes that were a letdown. It's gonna be exciting. The very first palette on my list is the Huda Beauty Khaki Haze palette. My Huda palettes are some of my very favorite. I talked about two of them in my last video, the Naughty Nude? Is it Naughty Nude? Or is it just Naughty? The Naughty palette and the Nude Medium. I also have the Rose Quartz palette and her new Nude. The way she can take a neutral palette and laden it with all of these inspiring, glimmering metallics and shimmers. They're just some of my very favorites. So when I saw she was releasing the Khaki Haze palette, my heart fluttered. If you've seen any of my videos, you know my longing for earthy, grungy greens. If you've not seen my videos, I love earthy, grungy greens. And this palette, this take on an earthy, grungy green color story with these pops of beautiful, ethereal, glimmering toppers, how could I resist something like that? Despite reading and watching various relatively negative reviews, I still insisted on purchasing this palette and, well, had to find out on my own that it was indeed a letdown of a palette. This is one palette that I truly think is not good. Despite absolutely loving the color story, this was by far the worst Huda formula I've ever tried. The matte seemed really firmly pressed compared to her other palettes. They're really thin and dry, and when I'd try to blend them, they would sort of dissipate into nothing. I could get it to work. It took some work, it took a little muscle, and when I would finally get the base of my eye look done, I would go to apply one of the shimmers. And the shimmers were the most disappointing of all. They too were quite thin. You know, the metallics and shimmers in our other palettes have this bounce, this texture to them. These again were just really dry and hard to pick up. Even in swatching, they didn't have that reflective nature that Huda's metallics usually have. When I'm using the Rose Quartz palette, for example, I'll pick up one of the shimmers and I literally can't wait to put it on my eyes because it just looks so beautiful. And it doesn't disappoint when I do. This, I put it on my finger and it was like, where's the pigment? Attempting to apply the shimmers on top of the mattes, again, they just seem to like blend each other away. It was just such a frustrating experience. Far from the quality that I desire from a Huda palette, that I expect from a Huda palette, really. One of the biggest complaints I hear about the Huda palettes are that they're always a neutral. While that is something I love about them, I get where they're coming from. I feel that this palette specifically was just so unique, a little bit different for Huda. That grungy, earthy take with these pops of a Huda etherealness in it. Such a missed opportunity to have it be such poor quality. It was almost like the palette had been sitting in the back of a warehouse for a couple of years and had dried out, and then she decided to release the palettes. Such a letdown. Next is the Urban Decay Party Favor palette. This was a limited edition holiday release back in 2019. I wasn't going to mention this palette because it's no longer available, but I still hear other YouTubers hype about it once in a while on their channels, and because it was just such a major letdown for me, I have to talk about it. I love shimmer, I love glimmer, I love neutrals. This palette had it all. How could I not love it? Let me tell you why. Looking at the shadows in the palette, we have a beautiful coppery orange, a warm reddish brown, a gold, and mid-tone taupe. We have these beautiful neutral colors. However, similar to how I described the Huda shimmers in the khaki palette, the base color wasn't very strong. So if I wanted to use them as a topper, or even just as a one and done shadow, it took a lot to really build up a base color. They never really built up to give my lids the luster and the sparkle I desire, that I fantasized. These shadows were allegedly Urban Decay's Moondust formula. I have a couple of the Moondust shadows, and those are beautiful, pigmented, sparkly. Those are what I was hoping for. Especially with the name Party Favor, you would expect sparkle, some pizzazz, and they were more like the morning after. Like you had crashed out, fell asleep hard on your pillow, your makeup had rubbed off on your pillowcase, and this was the result the next morning. They were really lackluster. They lacked the magic the Moondust shadows have. And so while I kept it around for a while, I tried various ways of trying to apply the shadows, wet, dry, with a brush, with the finger, with the will in my heart, and it just never lived up to the fantasy. And thus, I decluttered it. The next palette is one I'm most afraid to speak of because I know I'm gonna get some heat, and that's okay, that's okay. Like I said in the intro, our differing preferences, our different opinions are what make this beauty community what it is. I'm gonna talk about the Natasha Denona Mini Retro palette. This was my very first Natasha Denona palette, so I was extra excited because Natasha Denona, that girl gets some hype. At that time, and even now still today, in the world of eyeshadow palettes, I feel is a very unique color story. It's different, it's inspiring. You get these pops of grungy, earthy colors paired with these complementary, girly, blushy pinks. You know, the thing is, I had previously duped out this palette within my own collection. I do this often. When I see a palette, when I see a color story that makes me feel a certain way, I will try to dupe it out, and then if I enjoy the dupe and I'm using it enough, I justify that as reason to purchase the palette. Which honestly, saying that out loud right now doesn't make any logical sense.
You sound insane.
If I have duped it out and I'm using the dupe often enough, I should be content with the dupe, right? Save my money. I gotta retire someday. But no, I find it as justification to go ahead and buy the real thing. After I had the real mini retro, I liked my dupes better. They were more pigmented, they were more true to color. My qualm with the mini retro was largely that it lacked depth for me. You know, it only had 2 matte shades, one of which was a matte peachy pink. That shade was so light on me. It was almost useless because all I could really do was add a little depth in my crease. And then the other matte, which appeared to be sort of an olive green, pulled more gray on me. Now, as far as the 3 shimmers, those were quite beautiful, I have to admit. They were very pigmented, they were very buttery, they really did shine and glimmer on my lids. But again, my big qualm, the fantasy of this palette to me were the pinks and these earthy grungy greens. And neither of those colors really seemed to translate. The main shade I was drawn to, the shade Industrial, again, the one that looks to be an olive, sparkly metallic green, pulled gray on me. So with 3 of the 5 shades not being what I had hoped for, this palette was a major letdown. I found I ended up using it largely just for color inspiration because I would end up using other single shadows to achieve the depth I desire and the green, the olive green I wanted. Rather than using Industrial on my lids, I would instead reach for my dupe, which was the L'Oreal Infallible shadow in the shade Gilded Envy. That was the color I wanted. that shows up as a true murky, grungy olive green on my lids. I painfully regret not doing swatches of the Mini Retro when I had it so I can compare it to the dupes to share. I can't believe I forgot to do that. But I did do swatch comparisons of the shade Industrial and the L'Oreal Infallible Gilded Envy. In watching reviews of the Mini Retro, it was a complaint I heard from a couple people that these grungy greens pulled more gray on their skin tone. So if by chance that happened to be you and you felt a little let down by the Mini Retro, I highly recommend checking out the L'Oreal Shadow. I like that one so much more. So in the end, it's not that it was necessarily a bad palette. I think it has so much potential. Again, the color inspiration and the formula in all 5 shadows was very good. It's just the color story, the true translation on the eyes left a lot to be desired. This palette lacked depth and contrast. The fantasy of this palette, fulfilling all of my wildest dreams, was completely unrealistic. Because makeup can't do that. But in performance, for sure, the fantasy was unfulfilled. I was sadly let down. The next palette is one I still do own. Let me tell you, I haven't purchased very many eyeshadow palettes this year. So when I had an inkling to purchase this palette, I had 0 ounces of guilt, and I was so excited. It is the Lunar Beauty Nude Prism palette. Fellow neutral lovers, does this beautifully well done neutral color story not romanticize your heart just a little bit? Because it certainly did mine. This was my first time trying the Lunar Beauty formula. And again, I just want to be very clear. This is not a bad palette. In fact, I did a mini review on my Instagram. I will pop the reel up on the screen here for you so you can see swatches because I don't plan on keeping this palette, so I want to avoid touching it and swatching it any further. I feel I gave it a fairly good review. It's just that in the end, it just didn't suit my preferences, my needs when it comes to my eyeshadow looks. It didn't fulfill the fantasy. In looking at swatches, specifically the shimmers, which is what I am here for. I could probably dupe out these mattes within my collection, but it was the way these metallics glimmered and shined in the swatches. They looked so special. Again, the fantasy was real, but in the end, they were a far cry from my fantasy. I'll get to them in just a second. First, I want to talk about the mattes. First of all, my biggest gripe when it comes to neutral palettes is when they don't offer variety and depth. I want my mattes to go from an ultra light to the mid-tone to the deepest sultry dark. I often find neutral palettes lack either the mid-tone browns to provide that gradient, or they don't have something deep and dark enough to smoke out the outer corner or to use as liner. Therefore, I feel the palette is limiting in the types and number of looks I can create. Looking at this palette, this is perfection because not only does this provide what I would deem the gold standard for variety of depth in their mattes, but the mattes are very nice. I also like that it has a variety of warm and cool tones. The first time I used this palette, I sat down and started as I normally do. I put something through my crease, something in the outer corner. Everything was going beautifully. It was a little romantic love story happening right here in my bedroom. And then when I went to use the shimmers, the shimmers are where the letdown happens. They're a little more firmly pressed, but they still have a slight bounce. They're quite thin in consistency. So I found when using them as a topper shade, especially over a darker matte, it really takes a lot for it to be opaque and be that standout center shade. They don't look the way they do in the swatches. Even in my own swatches, I feel they don't appear to be quite that sparkly on the eyes. Very similarly to the Party Favor palette, I feel they're more reflective than they are sparkly. Which again, depending on your makeup preferences, maybe that's what you want. But another issue I have is there isn't a lot of variation amongst these metallics ones on the lid, specifically these 3. This one's a little bit different because it has a slight duochrome, and this one, this chocolate brown, if you have been here, you know my love for chocolate browns. It's just so light. I've experimented with the metallics numerous times. I've tried applying them wet with a different primer, with a glitter glue, and even then, they're only okay. Oh, the pain I feel is real. I feel if you are someone who likes more of that wet eye look, you like a more subtle sparkle, I think you would really enjoy the metallics in this palette. But if you're like me and you really like the sparkle, you want your center shade to be show-stopping, I think you'll be a little bit let down by this palette like I was. I want these so badly to be foiled and sparkling and show-stopping, and they're just not. And therefore, it was a letdown. A big one. The potential I see here could be amazing. Alright guys, that is going to conclude this video. I did have one more palette to talk about, however, it is after 5 o'clock, the sun is going down, and I already know the lighting quality of this video is not going to be very good. I apologize again. However, if you enjoyed watching and you'd like me to do part 2, I certainly could. I hope I didn't hit too hard in the feels talking about any of these palettes. Whether you agreed or disagreed, I would love it if you left a comment. Let me know all your thoughts. Also, let me know what palettes were let down for you. Leave me your sad stories down below. We can grieve together. It is a very unique heartbreak, isn't it? I mean, the loss of the money spent, of course, but the loss of that fantasy is the true pain in the end. I want to thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for hanging out with me and hearing me complain about eyeshadow palettes. I hope you hit the subscribe button so you can come back next time. And until next time, I hope you have the most wonderful day. And ultimately, you end up purchasing it because of the... Before we get into the video, I just want to... Words. The first palette on my list is the... You like your metallics to be vibrant. You want that shimmer shade. When you get the palette, when you get it in your hands and you put it on your eyes and that fantasy just bursts into flames, obliterates to smithereens, washes away, blows to smithereens. It goes unfulfilled. That is going to conclude. Alright guys, that is going to conclude. Alright guys, that is going to conclude.